Mid-March in the Wye Valley is a far cry from the Cheshire Plain, but few could deny its grandeur. On its loose limestone slopes, once alive with the fires of industry, an unusual shrub now blooms. I followed one of the many ancient tracks crossing the steep valley side to find it. The plant is called Mesoreon, and although a native of our limestone woodlands, it's very rarely found. Not only is it a temperamental flower, but also it's a favourite of collectors who often spot the blooms in early March and will dig it up and take it to grow in their own homes. The Latin name for the plant is Daphne Mesoreum, which relates to an ancient Greek myth where Daphne appeared to Aphrodite in order to save her from a lustful god. But as punishment, Daphne was turned into a tree, and from then on her flowers were worn by virgins to preserve their purity. The tiny pink flowers of the Mesoreon grow right off the stem. These little florets, when they do appear, can be very, very numerous, and indeed there is something inside the buds called a heat shock protein that not only helps the plant decide when it's going to flower, but how much it will flower. There's a thought that the plant can actually decide for itself that it's not going to survive the next winter, and so in the spring it produces a much larger amount of flowers than it usually would, and so in the summer a larger amount of fruit as well. Although toxic to us, of course, birds can eat the fruit, and after eating it they disperse the seeds over a much wider radius. The sap was used in the past to produce redness on the skin, avoiding the need for expensive rouge, but the red effect triggered by the sap was in fact the result of damage to the blood vessels, a large price to pay in the long term. In the 1500s, the sap was also used as an alcoholic purge. Consumption resulted in violent choking and vomiting, which discouraged further drinking. Of course, just because a plant is rare or unusual doesn't necessarily mean that it grows in the most inaccessible of locations. Here in the Wye Valley, the Mesoreon grows right in the shadow of the massive Millersdale lime workings. The limestone did not just attract plants, it was too valuable a resource not to exploit for our own industrial development. The Millersdale Lime Works opened in 1878, and these massive structures produced millions of tons of quicklime over the years that they were operating. The quicklime was used in the chemical and steel industries as well as an important fertiliser for farmland. Let's take a look at how they work. At the base of the shaft, a large coal fire would be lit, and then from the charge hole above, alternate layers of coal and limestone would be continually added. The kiln could be kept alight for days, and temperatures could reach a massive 900 degrees Celsius. At the bottom here we have the draw hole, and there were two products released by the process, carbon dioxide and the important quicklime which the men needed. The quicklime came through the grate to the bottom and then would be shovelled out by the men. This here is known as the kiln eye, and it was specifically built not only to keep the wind and the rain out, but also to ensure that enough air could be brought up to keep the fires at that incredibly high temperature. It was quite a dangerous business, and the men who worked down here could suffer terrible injuries. Quicklime is very corrosive and could damage the skin, and if you got it into your eyes it could even cause you to go blind.
Raw limestone could not be used in the process and had to be ground down to chunks 1 to 2.5 inches in size. The remains of the hoppers and processors line the woods beside the kilns. From the kiln summit, you can see down to the trackbed which carried the quicklime to local towns and cities. Just south of the kilns is the remains of the disused Millersdale station. This was quite a sprawling site, with a whole series of buildings and sidings constructed to serve quarries, farms and passengers. The most dramatic view, however, is that of the two massive viaducts just below the station. The original viaduct is a classic affair, with 3 iron arches spanning the great gorge of the Wye River. But traffic increased quickly to such a level that only a few years later, in 1903, it was necessary to construct a second bridge and install a double-loop track. This 20th century bridge may not be as pretty as the first, but its unusual design means that it is now a Grade 2 listed structure. The first trains steamed through the deep gorges of the Wye Valley in 1863 and were part of a long envisioned rail scheme. In 1845, the then Manchester, Buxton, Matlock and Midland Junction Railway placed plans with Parliament for a link across the Peak District to link Derbyshire with Lancashire. They even had the great engineer George Stephenson on board, who was the first to recommend that the line should follow the route of the Wye Valley. Construction began with a modest line being laid from Ambergate in southern Derbyshire to Rowsley, just south of Bakewell, but money was not forthcoming for its extension. It then became the ambitious Midland Railway who finally secured the 15-mile extension to Buxton. Over the following years, a total of 7 tunnels, 2,133 yards long, were excavated through the tough limestone. This led to the first trains speeding through the valley in the May of 1863. After completion, the line was used not only for freight, but also for the Midlands London Express, the first of which hurtled through the peaks in February 1867. The line continued to serve an important role in the local economy and played its part during both of the World Wars until, with the losses being suffered by British Rail in the late 1950s, it was identified by Dr. Beeching as one of the hundreds of lines to be closed. On March 5, 1967, the last train left Millersdale Station. The express trains continued for a while, until even they were closed and diverted to the new and improved main line. The track of the railway has now been turned into the Monsell Trail, just one of many easy routes available for those wishing to explore the Peak District on foot. It is a blessing that these lines were safe for walkers and not turned into roads which would have destroyed the peace that can still be experienced in many of the hidden places the ghostly line now passes through.
There are many other abandoned railways in the Peak District, some of which closed long before Beeching's axe fell. My personal favourite is the track bed which follows the route of the long-vanished Leek and Manifold Valley Light Railway. Authorised in 1898, the Leek and Manifold Valley Light Railway continued from the ending of the North Staffordshire Railways line at Waterhouses. The line's engineer, Everard Calthrop, was a leading advocate of narrow gauge railways, having previously designed and built the Barzi Light Railway in India. The track was constructed to a very high standard at 2 foot 6 inch gauge with a yard of rail weighing 35 pounds. So great was the quality of the material that in the railway's 30 years no relaying was necessary. The train started and finished at Hugh End, where the engine sheds were located, and from there ran for 8¼ miles through some of the most beautiful scenery in the Peak District, following the deep limestone gorges of the Manifold and Hamps Valley. The return journey from Waterhouses was hard work for the trains, with a 1 in 40 gradient to climb. For such a small railway, there were a large number of stations, all linking to local villages and beauty spots, though in fact the engine driver would stop anywhere along the line if he saw somebody wanting a lift. The line officially opened on Monday 27th of June 1904, with large crowds gathered for what the Earl of Dartmouth called an exceedingly pleasant journey. Indeed, travellers found it easy to appreciate the views along the route, as with a maximum speed of 15 miles an hour, the whole journey took around an hour. Crowds continued to gather on bank holidays, and freight rolling stock had to be used to deal with the numbers. Whit Sunday weekend in 1905 saw some 5,000 passengers carried around the valley between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. 2 trains, E.R. Calthrop, named after the line's engineer, and J.B. Earl, who was the resident engineer, were built specifically for the line, and painted in a classic brown and black with a gold lining. Calthrop was very fond of colonial designs, giving both trains large headlights, that were never used, and fittings for cowcatchers, which again were never used. The valley had only a single line, so only one locomotive was ever usually in steam. Most outbound freight on the railway was milk and dairy products from the Ecton Creamery. Every day, 300 milk churns made their journey down the valley to Waterhouses, where they were put on a special express train to London. In 1922, a total of 3,261,060 gallons of milk came out of Ecton. The line at Waterhouses was a standard gauge, so special wagons were constructed to allow stock to be carried piggyback style. The extra height necessary is what gives Swainsley Tunnel its unusual appearance. 164 yards long, the only tunnel on the line was built at the insistence of Thomas Wardle, who didn't want the view from his Swainsley Hall ruined by this modern industry. It was hoped that the railway may also have restarted the local copper mining industry at Ecton, but it did not. First mined during the Bronze Age, the richest deposits of copper were mined out by the Duke of Devonshire in the 17th and 18th centuries. Any copper left was too deep to be profitable. The railway continued to run quietly for several decades until, in 1932, a disaster struck with the closure of the Ecton Dairy. The company had decided to concentrate on its new Rowsley Creamery. Along with the development of bus services to many of the isolated villages, this was the cloister bell chiming for the Leek and Manifold Valley Light Railway. The last train chugged quietly down the valley on Saturday, March the 10th, 1934. Few supporters turned up on the day for the final ride. It was cold, misty, and snow lay heavy on the ground. The line closed just weeks before its 30th anniversary. There has been much speculation about whether the line could have been saved. There was once a proposed extension to Buxton, which could have saved it, and its closure was only a few years before the first enthusiasts began buying up the country's most pretty lines for conservation. We do, however, have one blessing. Quickly after its closure, the line was purchased by the Staffordshire County Council, who converted most of the route into a public footpath, and now walkers, cyclists and horse riders can enjoy the tranquility of the Manifold and Hamps valleys without the fear of passing cars.